Hi, I'm Stephanie.
And I'm Kevin.
We're from Live Edge Timber Co. And today we are so excited to be presenting our TimberCast Casting Epoxy. So on this first video, we're going to go through epoxy FAQs. I'm going to be doing most of the question asking, and then Kevin is our resident epoxy expert, so he's going to be answering our questions. So first question is, what is casting epoxy, Kevin, and how is it different than other epoxies?
So on the market, there's three main types of epoxy. There's structural epoxies, there's finishing epoxies, and then there's casting epoxies. Casting epoxies are for generally thick pours, and they're used for art projects, encapsulating objects. They're used for river tables like I have over here. And that's really what we've brought to the table is our own personal casting epoxy that we're really happy with. The other types of epoxy, structural epoxy, is used for lamination. It's used for making, like cedar strip canoes, carbon fiber parts, and aerospace and spacecraft, even everything. And then we have finishing epoxies, which are used to replace varnish. It gives you a really perfect mirror finish, and they're generally for going about 1/8 of an inch thick at the most.
So what would I need to know if I was doing an epoxy project?
So with any kind of epoxy, it's very important to know that unlike a varnish or a paint, epoxies are not drying through evaporation. They're actually drying through a chemical reaction. So any chemical reaction will generate heat, and too much heat is never a good thing. So when you're doing your epoxy project, you have to keep in mind temperature. So if it's 45 degrees in your workspace, don't try to do a super thick, huge pour because it's going to overheat and it's going to crack. Another very important thing to think of is because of this heat buildup, and it's known as exothermal heat, the more thickness that you have, so the thicker you're pouring at a single shot, the more heat will build up within your project. So if you're pouring, let's say, a river like this that's 4 inches wide and 6 feet long, if you're doing it 1 inch thick, it's going to have about the same surface area to dissipate that heat as if you're putting it 2 inches thick. So again, if I'm in a cooler ambient temperature, let's say under 30 degrees, I'll be able to do that 2 inches in a single cast. But if it's 45 degrees in my shop, well, your table is going to overheat and you're going to have issues. And that overheating will often cause cracking. It can cause lots of air to come out of your wood and just litter your epoxy river with bubbles.
Sounds good. So what does someone need in order to get ready for epoxy? Let me get out my toolkit.
Okay, so the main thing that of course you need is a cup to mix it in. Okay, I have here a 750 milliliter mixing cup, and of course you're going to have to mix it. And I always use my cell phone as well for a timer because it's very important that the epoxy be thoroughly mixed, because if it's not, you're going to end up with soft, mushy spots in your epoxy you'll have to scrape out, and you'll have to try to save your project. It's happened to me, believe me, you don't want that. So when you are mixing, make sure you mix for at least a solid 3 minutes, and you'll be able to see actually the difference in color between the hardener and the epoxy until it's well mixed, and it'll kind of look like folds inside your pot. So that's another reason why I really like to use a clear pot. It makes it much easier to visualize that. The other thing you want is a good pair of latex gloves to protect your hands, because it is no fun trying to wash epoxy off your hands. If you let it dry, it's going to come off with your skin. And then the other thing that I recommend highly is to use vapor barrier on the floor where you're working, because I've done maybe 2 projects with epoxy that have not spilled a little bit on the floor at the very least. And the nice thing with the vapor barrier is that the epoxy won't stick to it, so it makes cleanup very, very easy, and you can reuse that vapor barrier over and over again.
And the last and most important thing is your mold. And if you check out our next video, you'll get to see more details on that. So our TimberCast comes with pigments. So Kevin, how do you mix these into the epoxy?
So before you add the pigments to the epoxy will be crystal clear, and I have a little sample here. You can see straight through it. It's like glass.
And that's when you know you've mixed it enough. So when you can see through it clearly, you've mixed it enough.
Okay, so you can actually vary the amount of pigment that you're putting in to play with the opacity of your epoxy. So the more pigment you put in, the less opaque it's going to be. So if you want like this river here to be just solid color, you're going to put lots of pigment in. If you want to go a little more translucent, you can put a little less pigment in it. And you can actually play with it. So you're better off going a little bit less pigment first and then adding some if you need to. And I've actually added the pigment once I already had it in the table before. It's doable, not ideal, but doable. And so when you're going to be adding the pigment in, you're going to be adding it, of course, to your already mixed epoxy, so you can actually see those folds. If you have the pigment in it already, you won't be able to visually see that you've properly mixed the epoxy, so I don't recommend it. And the pigment is a powder that's in these tubes, so you're just going to sprinkle the powder into your epoxy mixing cup, and you're going to keep stirring. And it will want to stay on the surface, so when you mix, make sure you kind of gently beat it down and get it really thoroughly mixed.
How do you prep your material before you use the epoxy? Is there anything that you need to do first?
So whenever you're working with any sort of porous substance, such as wood, you want to make sure that you do a really good seal coat on the areas that are going to have epoxy. And that's because porous surfaces are full of air. Wood holds tons of air. So what can happen is if you do not do a proper seal coat, it can actually, the heat being generated by the epoxy can cause the air in the wood to expand, leaving the wood into your epoxy, and you have never-ending bubbles coming out. So I personally always do 2 seal coats, and you can actually do that right in your form. And if you're going to be seeing both sides, I recommend you do it ahead of time before you put your wood in your form. And if you do let it dry completely before you do your pour, as is in the case when you're doing it ahead of time, you want to make sure that it fully cures, and then you sand it before applying your pour, because if it's not sanded, you will not get a proper bond and it will delaminate.
And that seal coat is done with the casting epoxy?
Correct.
Okay, so once you've done your pour, Kevin, how do you finish the actual product that you've made?
So, generally speaking, when you're doing an epoxy river table, it's not going to be nice and perfect and smooth like this after. Is it possible? Of course. I've never done it. So I'm always building it up a little extra, and I often actually put a bead of silicone as a dam around where my river is going to be, because remember that this stuff is liquid almost as much as water, so it will go wherever gravity is taking it. So make sure your table is perfectly level. And another great way to make sure that it's perfectly level is actually to fill it close to the edge, and you can actually play with it a little bit, making it perfect, because nothing is perfectly straight. So you're gonna have a low spot somewhere. So this is the best way that I've personally found to make that happen. So because you're gonna have an excess on the top, I recommend you take a belt sander, a manual belt sander, a wide belt sander if you have it, but you don't have that at home, so I'm going to say a manual belt sander. You can sand it smooth, and you can sand it up with a random orbit sander up to about 220 grit, and then put a finishing oil like our Omnia onto your table. It comes out beautiful. And if you want a super high gloss finish, as in it was before you sanded it, you can actually sand that all the way up to 2000 and then buff it using a car polisher, and it'll come out crystal clear like this. That's what we did over here.
So speaking of Omnia, the number one question I get asked is, can you use our Omnia oil when you do a casting?
So yes, you can, short answer. This table here actually is finished with Omnia Natural. Because the river, however, on this one is a high polish, there's nothing to stick to it. We actually have an oval over here you can show that is finished where it's just sanded 220, and we applied the Omnia over the epoxy, so you guys can see what it looks like.
So if you see this one, you can see the difference. So this one we've gone over the Omnia right here, so you can see that the epoxy has become much more matte. So that's also possible.
And this is a much, much easier project to do because polishing is a lot of work. To give you guys an idea, this table here took about 4 hours to polish.
So the next most common question I get is, how do I know how much casting epoxy I need to buy for my project?
Okay, so in order to figure that out, it's very, very simple. What I usually do is I take a tape measure and on 6 feet, I'll take about 8 measurements across the river, and I'll take the average width, and I'll take my thickness. So I'm calculating the volume. So volume is length times width times height, and I do it in inches. And the nice thing about liters is liters are a volumetric measure, just like cubic inches. So you can actually convert cubic inches into liters. So what I usually do is I go on Google and I look up, cubic inches to liters, and I just type that in and it gives me my answer. But for those of you that don't want to go on Google, I'm just going to read my notes over here. Basically, you take your cubic inches and you divide them by 61.0237441.
Which you should see to Kevin's side, right there.
So I'll give you guys an example. So if you have a river that's 4 inches wide by 1.5 inches thick by 6 feet long, or 72 inches, okay, that gives you 432 cubic inches. Now if I divide 432 by 61.023, so on and so forth, that'll give me 7.08 liters. So you'll always want to buy a little bit more than you need in case you spill some on the floor, which happens a lot. And then you'll have some areas that have a little bit too much and some that have just not enough. And a lot of the time you'll want to let it kind of set up because you can't seem to get it level. You'll add a little bit on that low spot afterwards. So if you need 7 liters, I recommend you get maybe an extra quarter liter or so.
And we also have all these calculation details on our website. So if you go to the shop page and click on any of the epoxy items, you'll see that calculation that Kevin just talked about. So thanks for tuning in. Stay tuned for our next video all about TimberCast.